Great. Well, thank you all for being here and joining us. Welcome to the Fiberarts Guild of Pittsburgh Virtual Artist Talk. I'm Laura Domensic and the Executive Director of the Erie Art Museum. This exhibit features 35 artists and over 40 works, and it was juried by our program manager and designer, Jamie Kime-Pomorsky, and myself. And today we are delighted to introduce the Juror Award winners, Michelle Brown, Sarah Ensminger, Nancy Quick-Langer, Jane Ogren, and Camilla Brent Pierce. We're delighted to have the show in the Customs House, to have the Fiberarts Guild of Pittsburgh exhibiting here and with their members. The stately architecture within the space invites a conversation about history with any artwork that's displayed within it. And fiber as an art material is infused with stories of where and when diverse artistic traditions originated and how creative technologies developed. Both Jamie and I are painters, and so we thoroughly enjoyed the use of color in the work to portray intense energy and movement and the layering of textural elements throughout the exhibition. There's lots of themes of nature throughout the exhibition, which offer a rich experience, so we certainly encourage everyone to come and see the show in person. For the format of today's talk, each artist will speak for about 5 to 10 minutes and share their processes and experiences. And we ask that viewers please feel free to write your questions in the chat, but know that we will save them towards the end after all of the artists have presented. So thank you again. And I am pleased to introduce our first artist, Michelle Brown. Michelle?
Hello. We want to thank Laura and Jamie and Eric for working with Fiberarts Guild of Pittsburgh in organizing, jurying, and presenting this beautiful exhibition. We are so pleased and honored to be part of it. Thank you. First, I want to mention I have a tremor and a dysphonia, which causes my voice to sound old and creaky. I am fine, really. Can we have Jamie? Okay. I am fortunate to have 3 pieces in this exhibition. Each, I think, is very different from the other, but all 3 have this in common: the use of printmaking techniques, recycled or reused fabrics, and of course, fiber techniques. I've included more of my work so you can see a continuity or a context. You can see how the pieces relate to my other art work. Lean Logs is an installation. I love the installation at Erie with the black walls behind it. It's very mysterious. It's made from using acrylic paint, monotype technique, and flat cotton quilt batting, which is the material I use a lot in my work. It's not a usual fiber choice. The core of each piece is made with heavy wire and recycled towels. The logs can be bent, rearranged, hung from the ceiling, the wall, any which way. Next image, please. Here's a detail. You can see the patterning. The natural world is my inspiration, but I don't recreate. I cannot do justice to what is so beautiful and fragile in nature. I love creating these strong black and white patterns on the dimensional logs, and I hope the patterns speak to each other. And if you show the next slide, which I hope is the video, and click it on, you can see how the shapes speak to each other, and the work can be different from every angle. There's even one on the floor. It works with the ladder. It works, the light coming through. It's just a piece I really enjoy. Expanding, contracting. Next, please. This is an example of another installation piece I have, combining printmaking and fiber and some knitted squiggles, and also more cotton print batting. Next. This is another piece in the Erie show called Tangled Lines and Vines, and it combines some block prints. In the center, there's actually a wood block print that's horizontal, or silk organza. There's also monotypes and paper plate lithography, which is a printmaking technique using photocopies and a huge printing press and etching ink. There's a newspaper article underneath that I found amusing. It's about the sex life of grapes. And it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it carries my eyes all over the place. And I just like the drawing, the monotype, and the layering. Next, please. This is a large quilt. I don't make any quilts. I usually have to get tutoring, but the Guild has so many fine artists to help me. This uses, again, on the left, you see the block, the wood block, flowers and leaves. The figure, the face, and her hands, and the hills are all silk screened. And I use the circles are antique quilt shapes from a quilt that was falling apart. And I integrated with stitching under the head and cutting things up and collaging and stitching and just working it till it's right. Next, please. This is a large piece of my Floridora series. It's again on quilt batting. It's a soft material, and the imagery is mostly paper plate lithography, but the edges, there's a lot of the edging, the borders are monotype and needle felting. I like to create these dystopic environments in black and white, and then infuse color in it to help lead your eye into the piece or around the piece and keep your eye active. Next, please. This is another piece in the exhibition at Erie. It's called Blue Mars, and it was a tough piece to create. Um, it was inspired by um, red Mars, blue Mars, and green Mars, a series of science fiction books by Kim Stanley Robinson, and also my love of Chinese landscapes. The eerie colors make me think of perhaps it could be on Mars with strange clouds and colors and satellites. The book series are wonderful. There's a lot of reading, but it's very scientific, which goes right over my head, but there's also a great soap opera at the same time. So I do recommend it. And I'm glad I was able to push through to finish the piece because I really enjoy it now. And it's collage elements and layering. Next, how am I doing on timing? Okay, so this is another piece where, like the blue Mars, I'm using a lot of color and collage elements, not paying any attention to the rectangle. That's not really important to me. And playing with a little lace, a little transparent black organza, and monotype, and a little bit, taking collaging hand printed fabrics and putting them down and seeing where they create a visual image of a place or a thing that no one's ever seen before, even me. But I do have stacks and stacks and boxes and boxes of fabrics that I've created that are waiting to become a new piece. Next, please. This was in another guild show, another example of printed fabrics and painting a little bit. This is called The Octopus's Garden. Again, you can see the red circles are stamps I created. There's needle felting, lots of printmaking, sewing. Next, please. This is the end. Oh, and this goes back to 2010. Some of you may remember it. It's a quilt that I did in collaboration with two friends, and it got a prize in Fiberarts International, and all these fabrics were silk screened before they were cut and quilted. They were before they were silk screen, they were block printed and then blown up and made into huge silk screens. And this may have been the impetus for the way I work, this sort of laying down fabrics. And I don't know how quilters usually work, but I don't think I work that way. Is this my last piece, Jamie? No? Oh, And this is another example of my installations. This was at the Pittsburgh Center for Arts and Media before it closed. And these were pieces made out of old quilts and leftover printed fabrics and wood pallets and anything I could find to make them stand up or move. And this is called Roundup Garden. It's about the effects of poisons like Roundup on our environment and how plants in the future may not look the same as they do now. They may be distorted if they're not history, if they're not dead. Plants are resilient. Many probably will survive in one form or another. So this is my exaggerated garden. Next, please. And this is a little sort of a close-up, gives a scale of some kids spending and being happy to pose in the garden. And you can see some of the close-up images. It was great fun just to be as dystopic as I could. Next. And here's a single piece. I think I gave it a name, but I don't remember what it is. But I tried to use real wooden stands when I can. And it was just interesting creating objects that you could walk around. It's not something I had done before. Next.
Come on.
And this is probably the last piece, and a very old one where the black and white imagery was paper plate lithography. So in essence, it creates a coloring book for me to stitch around. And it was printed on my daughter's old baby blanket, which was a beautiful surface that took both the ink and the stitching beautifully. Thank you for listening. I hope you were able to understand me, and I'll be happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Next up is Sarah.
Hello, I'm Sarah Insminger. I'm an artist, photographer, and writer. I live and work in Northern Virginia. I'd also like to add my sincere appreciation to the Erie Art Museum for hosting our exhibit. You have a beautiful, beautiful space. I haven't had a chance to visit in person, but the images have been wonderful that you've put online for us. The next slide, please. Night Music is one of two pieces that were juried into this exhibition. So my work is primarily landscape based, and I would put that primarily at probably 99%. But using a horizon line to anchor the landscape has long been an integral part of my work. So it allows me to focus a viewer's attention on what it is in any particular landscape that I want to emphasize. So I usually begin each piece by determining where to place that horizon line, what time of day it is, what season it is, and what color language I think will create the necessary dialogue between my idea and the execution. So this piece is obviously at nighttime, and it illustrates a storm moving through the landscape, complete with wind and rain, which I think is probably the most illustrative of the work that I do, in the sense that it is about trying to create a feeling of whether you are in that landscape and you can hear that thunder and, lightning. So next slide, please. Fields of Red is my other piece in this exhibition. So while I rely mostly on photographs or memories of actual locations in my work, I also enjoy considering imaginary or dream-created landscapes as well. At its core, visual art is about storytelling, and we know that truth and reality has no place necessarily in storytelling. As a child, I would sit on my grandmother's porch, snapping beans with her and whatever else she thought needed to be done after the harvest from the garden. And she'd tell me stories, all sorts of stories. Um, and so then those days always seemed to be like the really hot days, the ones where you could like feel the sun just kind of shimmering everywhere. Everything was hot. Um, Other days when we weren't snapping the beans, I would sit in her large wicker porch swing, reading as many books as I could, all of which were filled with make-believe stories. So regardless of whether it's an actual location or an imagined one, what I'm trying to convey is how I see a particular landscape or how my interpretation of that scene makes me feel as I create the work. Next slide, please. My artwork is mixed media with a fabric fiber base. I paint, dye, and use a variety of surface design techniques to create the materials that I use. I layer different materials and art media as I work, and then use traditional textile construction techniques to hold the work together. One of my favorite art supplies is colored pencils, both water-soluble and those that are not. What I find to be the best part of working with fiber is that it is so versatile. And as long as you do not have it on stretcher bars at the very beginning, you can do pretty much anything you want with fabric. You can drive your car over it if you need tire tracks. You can put it through a printing press, whatever you want. And that versatility provides a challenge that just continues. So I don't know that I will tire of using this media at any particular point in time. The last step in pretty much any one of the pieces that I do is using threads to create that sense of movement and texture. And I use a domestic sewing machine for that part of the process. But using different types of art media is what lets me direct a viewer's eye to a specific place in the artwork. So for instance, in this piece, Afternoon Walk, I want you to notice the setting sun at the edge of the woods. Next slide, please. Our lives tend to be so chaotic and driven by events that are outside of our control. My desire is always to escape and find respite in the wide open spaces of nature. And that time that I spend both trying to heal myself and calm my mind in nature is what continues to inspire my artwork. I walk outdoors often and usually always with a camera in hand, recording anything that interests me, whether it's the sky, it's bark, it's grass, it's a small frog, doesn't matter. If it's of interest, I take its picture. But that desire for calm and simplicity in my life and my work has led me to create an increasingly spare artistic style, trying to find the minimal elements necessary to illustrate a landscape. So this particular quote by Hans Hofmann describes my desire to reduce visual overload. The ability to simplify means to eliminate the unnecessary so that the necessary may speak. So this artwork, Winter, is part of a series about seasons. I was looking for a way to illustrate as simply as possible what it felt like to be in each season in the landscape. By purposely reducing and abstracting some of the elements in a landscape, I also believe that it allows a viewer to overlay their own personal memories and experiences with my work, which then creates sort of a collective sense of place between the viewer and I. Next slide, please. So this artwork was commissioned for a healthcare facility and it's titled Healing Waters. It is about 52 inches by 154 inches installed. Cancer has impacted my family in unimaginable ways, and I have been thrilled to be able to complete commissions for several cancer centers. Art is healing, and I believe that when you are in a place that you know your mind is scattered in a million different ways, The ability to focus even just for a few minutes on a piece of artwork is a good thing. So let me tell you just a little bit, though, I guess, about my studio. So my studio is in my home, and I'm fortunate to have space for 4 work tables. They're all at different heights because things that we do need to be at different heights, and some of them are movable as well. So I tend to work moving between the work tables, my design wall, and my sewing machine, sort of like that magic triangle that kitchen designers talk about. The space that I have allows me to be able to have more than one piece under construction at a time, which is especially important for a triptych like this one, where I need to be able to see how the color moves across all the pieces, because I'm constantly trying to find ways to create depth that is both horizontal and vertical in nature. So I tend to keep my fabrics in ventilated bins in the closet, and I separate them by color. Keeping my fabrics out of my workspace, except for a specific project that might be under construction, and then organizing my art supplies by type and purpose allows me to concentrate on creating an artwork without the siren's call of color to distract me. So thank you for allowing me to share my artwork with you today, and I'll be happy to answer questions when we get to that point in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Nancy.
Hi. Wow. I am so inspired by both of you. Thank you so much. So I too want to start by thanking Laura and Jamie and Eric for hosting this artist talk today, and the Erie Art Museum for providing a beautiful, beautiful place for the Fiberart Guild's exhibition. So I'm going to talk a little bit about blackwork embroidery, which is what my piece is done in. This technique called blackwork dates back to the reign of Henry VIII. It's generally thought to have been introduced by Catherine of Aragon, who was Queen of England from 1509 to 1547, so quite old. And the idea is that she brought this technique from its Moorish roots in Spain. So there, I think, is some debate about English or Spanish origin for this type of work. Blackwork began as a counted thread embroidery worked in black silk thread on a fine linen cambric or Holland fabric. It was famed for its textural patterns and illustrative qualities, and often appeared on women's jackets and smocks and on the collars, sleeves, and cuffs of men's shirts. And you can see in the upper left corner of this slide an example of some historic blackwork. Today, embroidery artists use blackwork techniques in all kinds of interesting and innovative ways. Often you see photorealistic images like the dog in the lower right corner of this slide. The artists will also not limit themselves to black thread only, and will do all kinds of interesting things with color, as you can see in that rainbow design on the lower left. And I wanted to draw your attention to the upper right slide that shows the way you can use the thickness and weight of the thread to vary your color intensity and to create shading. So if you take a look at the swatch that is the second one down from the top, you get a really good picture of what happens to a design when you move from a 12 weight thread to an 8 weight thread to a 5 weight thread. It really changes it. And in some of these, it changes it so much that you're looking at, you can't even make out the design anymore. It really becomes so dense. And in the top swatch, this is a great example of another technique you can do with blackwork, which is, in addition to varying the weight of the thread, you can also break up the design. So if you take a look at the left, you see that this design that is moving into heavier thread as it goes right is not only using lighter thread, but breaking it up. So you get these broken kind of, well, it just changes the whole look of it. And then again, you can't see it really here on this slide, but I do encourage you, if you're interested, to, if you Google blackwork embroidery, you'll find photorealistic ones like this dog. And if you zoom in, what is creating the light, the sort of negative space on this, is this type of technique. It's really quite fascinating. So next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I design my tree stump, which is the piece that I have in the show. So I began with a software program called WinStitch, which I wanted to show you here. So this is on my computer, and it allows me to create designs or motifs and then repeat them easily to get a sense of how they will look in patterns. So this is just a simple example where you can see the diamond and the little sort of star that I made. You create the design first and call it a motif, and then you can just click and move it around and put it in, and it's very quick and easy to get a sense of what the finished pattern will look like. And with black work, because you use motifs that are simple on their own and then look very different when they're all put together, this software is very useful for that, as opposed to trying to draw it out on a grid by hand. The other thing I like about this software, for those of you who embroider and use DMC colors, you'll see here that this software program is preloaded with every DMC color. So you can, I didn't do this here, but if you wanted to really design something and figure out how the colors went together, you can actually do it in the program. Next slide. Okay, so this is a little bit of how it all came together. So the stump began, I laughed, Sarah, when you were talking about going out there with your camera, because I am that woman who wanders around my neighborhood taking pictures of things like stumps. Like, I'll just walk up into people's yards and I'm looking down at, because I'm fascinated with nature, and I'm always trying to figure out a way to incorporate what I see in the natural world into my embroidery. So this stump began as a photograph, upper left corner there, that I took. First, I enlarged it as big as I could get it, and then I transferred it into a line drawing, and I do that with a light pad. So on the upper right, you can see that initial line drawing that I created from the photograph. And then for this piece, I had to alter that a little bit more, because to make it really work for a black work piece, I had to think about the black work and how that was going to fit in, how I was going to make spaces for those patterns. So in the lower left, you can see the adjustment that I then made to make it workable for black work. And then the next step is to start working on motifs using my WinStitch software. So that's happening over on the lower right. And next slide. So here you can see a split screen. I had this idea of wanting the bottom part of the stump, the bark, to look a certain way. And this is inspired by trees. These are well established trees in my neighborhood and you may see these in your neighborhood, that have this kind of pattern of diamonds, and very rough, thick diamonds. So I came up with, so on the left, you can see the inspiration, and on the right, you can see the two blackwork designs, the diamonds plus the inner kind of magic that I wanted to put. And I used, a heavier weight thread for the diamond part, and a slightly lighter weight thread for that inner part. Okay, next slide, please. Here's an in progress. I use a frame to put my fabric on. I also transfer, once I've created the drawing, I do transfer that drawing to the fabric. Again, using my light pad, I take my drawn design and then I trace my drawn design onto my fabric. I use a permanent micron fine tip pen to do this. I started doing this a while back. I was worried about doing it initially because it's permanent, but I find it's much better when I know that I'm going to be covering those lines with my embroidery stitches. Um, However, if I know that I don't want to have a line, I will use a washable a washable marker, so that those blue blobs that are throughout the stump are these darker parts of the wood that I wanted to put in there, and I did not want to have a line separating them. So I use the blue marker, which washes out miraculously after I'm all done. Yes, next slide. And one more progress. I actually didn't, I apologize that I didn't include a finished photo of my piece. I guess I thought maybe that would be here already. So I apologize to all of you. You don't get to see the finished piece because this is the last slide. But it does give you a sense, a close-up of some of the work that I was doing. So I used a different black stitch motif inside each tree ring. In addition to varying the color of the thread and working with different thread weights, I also used the technique of loosening and breaking up the designs in places to create a sense of light. So you might notice that the colors on the left side of the piece are darker than on the right. I wanted to create the sense of the sun shining in from the right. So everything kind of moves in a lighter direction and a more open direction as you move right. You can see those little blobs that I was experimenting with, and I'm not sure if this photograph actually shows this, but I was using a darker color and I used it all the way around, and then I didn't like it because it was not it wasn't looking the way I wanted it to. So I did have to pick out all of those, probably those three that are not don't have any color in them yet. I had to pick them all out and start over again, which I do on with some regularity when I am embroidering. I also brought in some metallic threads, and in this piece you can sort of see across the piece because I was in the middle of stitching when I took it, and you can just barely see it lying on top of the fabric. I was bringing metallic in again on the right because I wanted more of a sense of the sun angling down onto the piece. And that's it. That's my piece, Tree Stump Among Leaves. Oh, one more thing I wanted to say is because the other Sarah and Michelle included such lovely photographs of some of their other work. So you can find photographs of my other work if you go to my Instagram, and that because I use that strictly for sharing my my embroidery work, and that is at Nancy_QL. So you can find me there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That was lovely. Jane, you have the screen.
Okay, I think you can hear me now. I'm Jane Ogren, and thanks for having us at the museum. And thank you, Jamie and Eric and Laura. I can't wait to see the actual show because sometimes fiber art doesn't really show up as well on a flat screen as it does in person. So go ahead and I'll go to the next slide. And first of all, I thought I'd show you my messy studio. I have two studios. I have one that I use exclusively for fiber art, and this is in a spare bedroom. And then down in my basement, I have another studio for my printmaking and painting and all the other stuff that I do along the way. And many times I combine those two things. You go to the next slide, please. And the piece that I have in the show is a rusted piece. So I'm going to show you several pieces and a little bit of my process as we go along. So next slide, please. This is the piece that's in the show. I thought I'd show you this first and then how I did it. You see a lot of embroidery on it, but you can also see from the five of us that we all do different things. Nancy uses a pattern and a computer, and it's very technical in her approach. And I just do, well, what should I put in there next? And so this is the piece that I did. Next slide, please. This is a close-up of it. I've done all this embroidery all the way around. Next slide, please. Okay, and you can see that I have left some of the nails in there that I have done. Sometimes that makes the whole piece warp somewhat. So sometimes I take some of the nails out, sometimes I leave some of them in. In this particular piece that's at the Erie Museum, I put stuffing in the center of this piece so that it gave it some dimension, but it also made it that it didn't wrinkle any longer. So we do all kinds of things along the way. Next slide, please. Now, this is the way I lay it out. And this happens to be on my kitchen table. But these are pieces that have already started to rust. You don't want to use ones that are totally rusted. You want the ones that are starting to rust. And this is the way I put it together. And you will see that it's in 3 separate pieces. I didn't use all 3 pieces. The bottom piece is the piece that has developed into the piece that was at the Erie Museum. You can also see I have some blue lines, because I wanted to do the circle correctly, and those all washed out. The other thing is, it just depends on what the temperature is outside, what the humidity is, how much you use to rust it. So sometimes a piece will lay in my garage for maybe a month, and I will check it. If it's not as rusty as I want it to be, then I will leave it for a little bit longer. What I use on it to advance the rust is I use vinegar. And some people dilute it. I do not. I use straight rust on it. And as it dries, I'll go out and I'll squirt it again. Even sometimes I have put it in a shallow pan so that it stays wet. But it then has a mind of its own. Some places will rust more than others. They're from all different things that I rust with, a lot of washers I use. Sometimes it's hard to find because so many things that you go to, maybe to Home Depot, are now zinc, and they do not rust like iron does. Next slide, please. Now, here it's in the process of rusting. And it's on a table, an aluminum table outside. This time, I took it from a different angle. So the top piece is the piece that I have used for this show. And I just keep squirting it and keeping it wet, squirting it, keeping it wet. You can see how it runs in different directions. So you have to have the table level or it will run one direction. Next slide, please. These are the other 2 pieces from the 3 pieces. And I have not decided what I'm going to do with these yet. So like everything else, I will put it away for a while. Then I'll get inspired again. And I may use these 2 pieces together, or I might use these again as single pieces. Next slide, please. And this piece shows up a little different in color, but it's because this is the very first piece I ever did. This is called Rusted Geometry, and it's highly quilted, but it's on fabric, it's on canvas, but it has been bleached, so it's much whiter than the canvas that I used on the other pieces. That was just a natural canvas. So I did the same thing. Some of the nails I took out, some of the nails I left in. This piece traveled really all over the place. It traveled with a quilt show. So it was in London, England. It traveled all around there. Then it came to the United States, traveled all around with this quilt show. So it was in like maybe 10 or 12 other states as it progressed. But I've used it a lot. I still have it, and I do like it. But that was my inspiration in my first piece. Next slide, please. I've used it in other things. These are little boxes that I made, and when I was doing it, I had newspaper laid down, and the newspaper also rusted. So I took those pieces made the boxes out of them. And then I did a lot of beadwork over the top. But in the center is usually the rusted piece. Very different than what I usually do. Next slide, please. And here's a close-up of one of them. So you can see all the newspaper on the outside and a close-up of the piece in the center. Next slide. Then I started to incorporate them and do more mixed media. This was in a show last year. Pieces sold the first night. And it has, some of them have netting on, some of them have scraps material. Some of the pieces have the washers that are already rusted, but they were not rusted on this piece. And the other, I have leather on it, just an assortment of mixed media objects. They were very fun to do. They're quite small. I'd say they're probably 8 by 8. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to include some of my other work, like a lot of the other people who are doing presentations today. And I guess I should tell you that my background is in art education. So I've taught a lot of things. I've taught elementary art, I've taught high school art, I've taught AP art. And so I do a lot of different things, but most of them stay still in the genre of fiber arts. And that's why I really, really like fiber arts. Because when I get tired of doing one thing, I can do another thing. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll see some of the things I've done. This is a self-portrait that I did right after the pandemic. And, you know, I don't know how you felt during the pandemic, but I really felt broken. And it was the inspiration for my piece. And honestly, I think I'm still recovering from the pandemic because I had no camaraderie, you know, other than Zoom meetings, things like that. I felt very alone. I thought, oh, I'm going to get all this work done because nobody's going to bother me. And it did sort of the opposite to me. I just need to be with other people. Next slide, please. This is a piece that I call it my car piece. I have 2 sons. They both live pretty far away. One lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. The other one lived in Philadelphia, but now lives in Kentucky. And, you know, they were long rides, like, you know, 8 hours, some of them. So I always had what I called the car box with me. My husband and I took turns driving, but when it was my time to sit, this is what I did. And this is a portrait of one of my niece's friends who came to the Chihuly exhibit a long time ago. And I said, well, I want to take your picture before you go home. So this is an actual person in here. And I did the portrait and I did it all in embroidery, all sitting in a car. So it's just fun to look at. I just do everything. I will tell you, I did do the portrait on the computer to break it down into different colors, but I just sat and did it and had fun and passed the time. Next slide, please. This is a portrait of my husband. And I painted the background first, and then I put these little snakes or whatever you want, coils on top of it. It looks just like my husband. And it's in going up my staircase, and every time I see it or anybody comes to my house, they say, oh, that's Bob. Next slide, please. I'd like to do portraits, and some of the things I'm going to show you are portraits. This is a portrait I did, and I did it on monk's cloth. If you know what monk's cloth is, it's a very open weave. And so what I did was something similar to what Nancy did. I put it through the computer. I decided what my light and my dark places would be. And then I used 3 colors to do it. And of course, the monk's cloth was white. But when this was in a show, and the response from the juror was, it looks like computer pixels. And I didn't see that at all until they told me that. But I enjoy I'll do one of these again. I think they're fun to do. Next slide, please. This is something totally different, but it is a coiled piece, so it is still considered Fiberart because I used a coiling procedure to do it, but that added all of these feathers. Excuse me, all these feathers to it. Let me get a drink. I'm just recovering from a bad cold and cough. Next slide, please. This is another basket that was a contemporary craft before they moved. It's really that rather large. I used an umbrella, the metal part that is in the umbrella. I took all the other fabric off, and I used that as a form to make this around, and left the form inside of it so that it would keep its shape. And this is just all scraps of mainly silk and pieces that I've used. Was sold the first night. So I was pleased with that, but I would really like to have it back someday. I like it. Next slide, please. This is the technique I used. It's a Japanese technique. It's used with polyester fabric. And then I put different shapes, glass shapes into it, rubber banded, put it in a pressure cooker at a high temperature when it's already dyed. The colors come out though when you do put it in the pressure cooker. And this is put around a metal base. So that's the reason the picture is like it is, so that you can see the curve to it. Okay, next. This is felt. This is all hand-dyed felt. And I had so many colors and I had such a big stack of it. I decided to do something with it, and I added some beads to it. It's quite a large piece, and it's been exhibited in various places. But you see, I am all over the place. You know, I go from one thing to the other, but it's always fiber art. Next slide, please. This is kind of a large piece. I think it doesn't show the color really well. The colors are very bright in it and vibrant. And this was over at the Concept Gallery if you are from Pittsburgh. And the theme was something that is circular. So in the middle, of course, is a circular shape. And in that shape are all those little pieces that have that Japanese technique to it that I had left over. You see plastic ties in it. You see yarn in it. You see all kinds of things. Along the side, the yellow, bright yellow pieces are rubber bands. And in the center, there's some orange rubber bands. So it's all over the place, but it's a weaving, and I do like to weave. Next slide, please. Then I got into doing some photography and then doing some things over top of it. So I ran this picture, which is a picture I took. It's actually Jefferson Memorial Cemetery. And it is, after I put it through the computer, then I took some other silk pieces. The base is on cotton. Then I used silk pieces and I ran those through the computer. And those are the lighter pieces that you can see. There's also some paper in it. The green parts are paper that I've run through it. And then I've done embroidery over the top of it. I've done some pieces that are similar to that. Afterwards, I do like the technique because I like photography. Next slide, please. This is my latest piece, and I have been experimenting with this and really like to do it. It could be considered improv quilting if you had a batting and if you had 3 layers to it, but mine is not that way. So I call these pieces, the series that I'm starting to do, this is not a quilt. But what it is it is a quilting technique, but instead of putting batting and all that other stuff on it, I just wrap it around a wooden form. So this is, I think, the last slide. So I know I went through this kind of quickly, but I wanted to leave some time for other people to talk about their work as well. So if you have any questions, well, you can ask them in the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Our final speaker is Camilla.
Hello, everyone, and I want to add my thanks to everyone else's, to Laura and Jamie and Eric and everyone at the Erie Museum for such a beautiful show. You know, seeing the work in the gallery makes such a difference, and it's an absolutely beautiful show. I also wanted to give a shout out to Debbie Penley and Debbie Tobin from the Guild and the exhibitions committee who did the heavy lift. Because the night of the opening, the weather was not really conducive, and it was a great turnout, and looking forward to seeing the show again later in the run. So I wanted to go a little more simple. If we could go with the next slide. I work in recycled materials and fabric that has a personal memory to me. And I also work very, very slowly. You know, the time is very inherent in the work, and having it be hand stitched really makes a difference. I've tried other methods of working and realized that showing the hand in the work is really important. I also love fabrics that have been darned and mended and that show their life experience and the recycling and the fortitude of, you know, the necessity of making do. And from a financial standpoint and also an emotional standpoint. I do have a pretty rigorous job, and so my work method is really conducive to finding time between the work to be able to make my artwork. So I assemble the pieces and then it's portable. So I work relatively small, and these pieces can go practically anywhere with me. And actually they go on vacation, they go to work. And they also have, because there's so much stitching involved, that there's a certain point that there may be a kind of exhaustion. And I love the term UFO, which is unfinished object, which I'm sure every artist has a number of those that, you know, many going at the same time. And, you know, this piece, which is in the show, Magician, As Above, So Below, was actually started in 2005. I had done a whole series, and I was using traditional quilt patterns. Bow ties is the basis for this work. And the whole series was called the Boxer Rebellion series, and I was using my late husband's boxers. He had a penchant for very colorful fabric, and when they wore out, I was recycling it. So I used the pattern within the fabric to riff on it. And with these pieces, I was using traditional quilt patterns originally and then just filling in the pattern. And then I realized that I loved the stitching so much that the stitching took over, and I've started to fill the entire surface following the pattern and realizing that, you know, in many instances, the back had as much, if not more, interest than the front. And when I showed pieces in exhibitions and everybody was like pulling them again off the wall to see the back, that I realized that in many instances, that was a more valid, you know, reference of the work. And in looking at this piece, and if you could toggle to the second image, that was actually the front. So I started with the colorful, you can see the tracing of the you know, the bow ties with the really colorful fabric. And there was an overlay of a hot pink, and I started stitching. So there is a whole layer of stitching on the pink layer. And then I started working in on the black. And then I hit a brick wall, absolute brick wall. And this piece went in a drawer for about 8 years. And I realized that I also work really well on deadline, and, you know, having kind of working piecemeal and slowly, that when I pulled this out again, I realized the front did not hold the interest. And it really was the back for me that showed the work. And usually I clean them up to the point where the back is as pristine as the front and there are no hanging threads. But in this instance, I really wanted to show the process and the time involved in the work, and also kind of where you think you're going with it, where you stop. If you could go to the next slide. So that's a detail, so you can see all the stitching that goes into each of the layers. So the entire surface, with the exception of the transparencies, is covered with small running stitches. And when I first started, I used the running stitch very intentionally, because that's the traditional quilting stitch. And I worked around the pattern of the quilting designs, but didn't do the fill. And then I realized that really it was the surface and that stitching that meant so much to me. And I was also using it as a meditation. I do watch a lot of bad television, because once you get to a certain point, the work is kind of mindless. Once you have the fabrics chosen, there's a certain point where you are doing infill. But it was also very meditative. I used it as kind of self-soothing. They were portable for a reason. The work, and I'll show you a piece later, that is the same kind of UFO that was started because, and it was therapy when my parents were ill. And I knew that I could take it with me. I could stitch in a hospital room, wherever it needed to go. It was there. And so this has been a really productive work process. And it's also a challenge, because you can't work very fast to get the work done. And but it's good to have a deadline, and also revisiting these pieces has been really helpful to bring them back. So if we could have the next detail. So that gives you an idea of the stitching on the front for comparison. So next slide. So this is the other piece in the show. The title is Lenore, and I based this piece, and it's small. It's 12 by 22 inches, including the fringe. And it's based on, I look at other fiber artists, especially historical artists. I look at painters. This is based on the artist Lenore Tawney, who did a whole series. If you're familiar with the work, they're amazing, beautiful installations that are, in some instances, are room-sized, and they're hung from the ceiling with amazing fringe, and they float, and they're airy, and they take up space, but they're very ethereal. And I was going for that same effect. And this piece includes fabric indigo dyed. And for the longtime members of the Guild, the fabric came from our friend Jan Bass. So a lot of times I pay tribute to friends who are no longer on the planet. And I love the play of transparencies, and the overlay is cotton organza that has been photo silk screened. And I haven't done a lot of silk screen. I did some intaglio in undergrad, and really loved the combination. And I was doing intaglio in fabric, and I loved Michelle's work for that reason, and combining the techniques. And so when we did a workshop at Artist Image Resource, I went crazy, and I was playing with all kinds of fabrics, doing it on solids, but I found the silk screen on translucent fabric was just mesmerizing. And I did several pieces that are standalones by themselves, but I wanted to pair it with a more substantive fabric to be able to give it a basis, and then also to have that etherealness as well. So this piece is hand stitched. So the top is hand stitched all the way about halfway down with white silk thread. And I usually work with silk at this point. I had been doing cotton threads, but I love the feel of it. It's thinner, and it also gives a certain sheen to the fabric that you don't get necessarily with the cotton. And then from the bottom, I did simple running stitches and then extending it to the fringe below. So the bottom piece actually it floats free from the background. So you get more of the transparency from the bottom layer. Next slide for a detail. So there you can see the stitching in the photo silk screen and the fringing. I love the kind of comparison between the sparkle of the metallic and then the substantive solidness of the silk above. Next slide. And this is another smaller piece of that silkscreen series. It's called Rust Belt Redux. And this is 11 by 9.9 inches. And again, this is done on recycled. It's actually a segment of a vintage silk nightgown that belonged to my grandmother. And so there's like handwork on the bottom. You can see the faggoting and that the hems are starting to rip off. And I love the fact that when it was printed, that the print stayed on part of the edge, but then you could see it starting to come apart. I do kind of tread the balance between, respecting the materials and wanting, and their history. And I've been asked if it matters to me whether, because the work, it's already using an impermanent basis, if archival quality is important to me. And I realized that, and I've done a lot of rust dyeing as well, and knowing that, that time and degradation is part of that process. And as much as we safeguard that, there is still that evolution and the destruction in some way of the material. And so when I hang my work, it's usually hung with either sewing pins or hat pins directly from the wall. And I've also, in certain instances, started leaving needles or pins in the work to reference the hand and the time and the process. Next slide. And the last piece I'm going to finish with is another UFO. The work is called Continuo. And it again was started in 2005. And it was finished to submit for and was in FY22 Fiberart International, which was at Contemporary Craft here in Pittsburgh, and then traveled to the Fort Collins Museum the following year. The work is it's silk fabric, and my grandfather was an interior designer back in the 30s through the 60s. And so the silk is actually leftover fabric from his practice. And it's rust dyed. And this one rusted a long time. I put it in a bucket. I kept throwing rust, grape skins, coffee grounds, anything I could think of into it. And would pull it out occasionally and then rinse it off and until I liked the surface. And I love the work of Agnes Martin and the field painters. And I wanted to capture, there's an amazing painting of hers in the Carnegie Museum. That's a gray field piece with a silver, a graphite grid. And the edges of the grid just shimmer. And so I laid in and it's hard to tell from the slide, but I laid in a very simple grid with the silver metallic thread, and then started infilling. So the top of the piece is when I started in 2005. And, at that point, it was going all different places when taking care of my parents. And I think the stitches show it. They were very tight. They were very, very intense, very, very layered. And at a certain point, it just got to be too much. So put it away. And pull it out occasionally, take a look at it and go, nope, not time yet. And then 6 months before the submission deadline for the international, I pulled it out and went, okay, its time has come. Different place, different time. A lot of water under the bridge, but it's time to finish. And so in picking it up, the stitches in the bottom half are looser. They're more spaced out. There's more room to breathe. And And when it goes to the bottom, you can see there's fringe on half of it and not on the other. And at the very bottom, the needle is still left in the piece. It becomes a question. Is it done? Is it not done? When is enough? When do you step away? And with 15 minutes before I had an appointment to have the piece shot, I stepped away and called it quits. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk today, and we'll answer any questions as part of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camilla, Nancy, Jane, Michelle, Sarah. This was really wonderful. I just have to say a couple words about that last piece. I just think that's so striking, and I certainly also have an affinity for Agnes Martin, and it reminds me of a piece of like a cross section of an earth sample or a core sample. So it's like you see the different layers of time in that way, which I think is really quite fascinating. Everybody's just obviously thrilled to have all of this work and all of your experience and process that you've shared with us. I do want to encourage, if anybody does have any questions, please, write them in the chat. I don't want to keep people too long. We are at about 1:15, but we definitely want to just thank everybody for being a part of this talk. And if it's possible, Jamie, if we can show a piece that the final piece of Nancy's black work that's in the show. Thank you. So we do get to see that piece.
Thank you.
I've of course I have a number of questions that that I'm just going to pick a couple of them that I had. I thought it was very interesting to see the processes and the very intentional process of Sarah versus some of the more freeform that Jane works with, and some of the connections between those. But one question I had for Michelle was, in looking at some of those pieces, the lean logs and also the video of them, have you ever considered exploring video or animation further in really having like a very dense forest of those pieces?
I love the idea. I have not, but I think it as I think about putting all the work in a room one day in a gallery, I think it would either be very cool to have a video or have something that actually moves in the space. I have to find a good tech person.
Yeah, find a collaborator.
But I love the idea. Thank you.
Of course. I was also just really struck by the process and of Sarah's it's so intentional about the organization of materials and not having that within your field, and then also the use of colored pencils, which I thought was really rather ingenious, but the idea of the stitch being last. It does seem to have like it almost kind of, with them being landscapes, it seems to have a sort of sense of the movement of the air in a way that I think is such an interesting paradox too.
Thank you.
And Nancy, and I guess this is for everyone actually, this use of different technologies, whether it is something that is very much of the hand or using the using computer programs to help create the patterns. I just think that's an interesting kind of comparison that you see that as well. And just how much each of you actually explore technology, computer technology in your work.
Yeah, I have to say this is the first time I ever used something like that, and I did it specifically because it was black work, and I I was trying to figure out how to see the bigger picture. And it's funny, I was thinking about what Camilla said about kind of like taking work with you and working as you're doing something else. And one thing about Black work that is just goes with the territory, and so is why I wouldn't do it at all the time as the only embroidery, is that I cannot do that. Like there's so much, you have to be 100% focused on it, or because if you miss a stitch, then the whole design falls apart. So I like the other kind of embroidery also.
Understandable. That's great. Yeah, I don't know that we have any other questions at the moment. This will be available. The video will be available on YouTube, on our website. But also Fiberarts Guild will also have that access to that as well. So it is accessible to everybody. Again, I just really am delighted to be able to share this time with you. And also, Camilla, if you don't mind, I would love to steal that UFO line. That is awesome. Um, so that's really wonderful. But we invite you all to see the exhibition in person. It's up through mid-January of 2025. I also wanted to invite you to our Up Close with the Collection event, which is July 25th, 6 to 8 p.m., where the entire museum will be open, but we will also have a meet and greet with the maker and artist, Aaron Kramer, who is an exhibiting artist behind the Sense of Wonder exhibition that we currently have up. And it also provides an opportunity to see some behind the scenes look at his process, but also highlighting some collection works that we do not currently have on display, but to be able to have some tours of our collection spaces. So please check out our website at www.erieartmuseum.org/upclose. You can get tickets there. And of course, you can always feel free to email or call the museum. Again, I just want to thank everybody for being here. And we very much thank all of the artists for participating today. Thank you.